Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Deltarune theory. Or should I say Deltarune prediction? If you're wondering why I'm making a Chapter 5 prediction video so soon, it's mostly because we got an announcement from Toby, and this is a very blurry screenshot because it was a Twitter post, that patches for Chapter 3 and 4 are done. This was as of like August 25th or something like that. And sometime during this month of September, we will be getting our next newsletter, which will probably give us a pretty good insight onto what we're going to be speculating on about Chapter 5 for the next year, right? The progress update that we got for Chapter 3 and 4, it gave us a lot. Like, that was the one where we got the songs and the green room and all of that. So it's very possible this could be pretty big too. So just letting you know. And of course that explains why I have to get this video out now, because if I don't, I mean, some of these predictions could be proven wrong, and I think it's a fun thought experiment. So here we go. Let's start with what we actually know. Almost certainly the fountain is going to be within Asgore's flower shop. So it's probably going to be themed around gardening, plants, maybe comic books and TV, because those are also there. Evil Tenna, friend inside of me, who knows. Even if you don't believe necessarily that like the whole fountain is going to take place within Asgore's flower shop, there will be probably a fountain within Asgore's flower shop. It's really the only place that makes sense to be a garden charred in an inferno of jealousy, says Gerson over here. And yes, Gerson gave us a lot of hints in his boss fight, which is very kind of him. Thanks, Gerson. So what does burned by jealousy mean? Well, we know one reason why Asgore specifically might be jealous, and that would be the fact that Sans and Toriel spent the night together last night in terms of Deltarune time. So if he finds that out, he's been trying so desperately to just fix everything before Asriel gets home. Asriel could show up in this chapter. Maybe at the end. I'm not very confident he'll actually show up for the main content. I think if he is going to show up, it'll be like right near the end of the game. Because he's too interconnected with everything, with Des and the family and all that stuff. So, he's the X factor that's going to bring everything home, quite literally, at the end of the game, in my opinion. I do believe the main boss of this Dark Fountain is going to be Asgore. Maybe not in the sense of like the way King and Queen were specifically trying to protect the Dark Fountain to like create the roaring or whatever. But in the sense that he wants to keep this garden world going. He doesn't want it to disappear. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The main reason that I believe this is that there is, of course, the prophecy in Chapter 4, that is the Flower Man trapped in Asylum. The picture's going to come up later on in this slideshow. And that picture, that prophecy, is labeled the same way as the Queen's Chariot Cannot Be Stopped prophecy, which obviously relates to Queen, and Lord of Screens Cleaved Red by Blade, which obviously relates to Tenna getting slashed in half. All that together kind of implies that Asgore is going to be on the same level as those two bosses, which is actually interesting, right? Because if we follow this pattern, Tenna, technically not the final boss of Chapter 3, right? I mean, he is the main boss. He's the one we have a real boss fight with. But the Knight comes in and is a much more powerful foe that we fight afterwards. And you could arguably say the same thing about Queen. Now, Giga Queen is just Queen, but we don't win that fight, right? Queen blows up our mech and almost kills us. So if we follow that to its logical conclusion, Asgore might be the main boss, quote unquote, of Chapter 5, but something else is going to be the big threat at the end that we don't necessarily defeat. That might be like reading too far into things. It's quite possible. But I could also see that being the case because Asgore actually being the final boss does feel a little underwhelming, right? I will get into some more about Asgore later. He's got his own slide, so we'll get there. The final thing that we know is that the the line right before Gerson says this one, where he says the vast garden is charred in an inferno of jealousy, he says the fields of pink and gold, right? Is also part of this chapter. And I didn't really think Friend would show up in chapter 5 until I realized, oh yeah, everything we've heard about Friend so far has to do with trees, right? And plants. He's, related to the forgotten man who hides behind the tree a little bit. Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. I've talked about before how where the forest would grow is such a weird line, right? Because it means they're lost where a forest will be eventually. But that makes sense if the forest is a dark world forest, because the forest doesn't exist right now, right? It's going to come to be a forest when whoever creates the Dark Fountain in Chapter 5 creates the Dark Fountain in Chapter 5. So Lost where the forest would grow actually does start to make some sense in that way. And yeah, that kind of ties together Friend into the mix. So, I mean, Friend could be the big super boss that we don't end up actually defeating in this chapter. It would be fitting if we, met the Knight in Chapter 3 and then Friend in Chapter 5 and the Titan in Chapter 4, like we're escalating, I think that does make some sense. So let's start with the most probably sensational part of the next chapter, which is these dang flowers. Now, okay, first things first, I remember a comment about this all the way back in one of my Chapter 2 theory videos, and it sucks because I don't remember what it was actually about, or I could probably search and find it, but it was someone who was saying plants wouldn't turn into darkeners because plants are alive. Which does make sense, right? But we now have proof that plants do sort of turn into darkeners with the cactus in Chapter 3 behind the curtain, right? You get the Saber 10 when you talk to it, which, of course, confirms it is the cactus, actually, and not somebody else. The dominant theory right now, or at least the one I see the most, I guess it technically might not be the dominant one, is that these 7 flowers will turn into darkeners that sort of call back to the 7 human souls from Undertale. And that does make sense, as much as it sounds stupid, okay? Because a lot of what's been going on in Deltarune has been making up for stuff that couldn't or didn't happen in Undertale, right? Like, we fought Spamton Neo because we didn't fight Mettaton Neo. We had, more to do with Asgore so far. We've sort of delved into Toriel as a character more so far. It's kind of like makeup work from Undertale in some ways. And I'm not saying that to say like, oh, Deltarune is just like, a watered down Undertale, because that's certainly not true. But it would be within, logical understanding for Toby to take these 7 flowers and fill in a gap from Undertale, which is, the 7 human souls. However, I don't think it's necessarily going to be exactly that. I think the traits might carry over, but we actually have some history about these flowers within Deltarune's world. Specifically, they seem to be Asgore and Toriel's wedding bouquet. There's a couple lines, one on Asgore's fridge. It's the text description of a photo on the fridge. It says, "A photo of your mother and father on their wedding day. She's holding a bouquet of 7 flowers." Sounds familiar. "A reindeer-looking monster stands nearby in a tuxedo. They all look happy." It is kind of funny there's no Carol there. I mean, unless Carol was wearing the tuxedo. Who knows? But I don't know what that means. Anyway, there's also a line from Asgore later when you're in that area where he says, "Yes, these flowers are still kicking. Quite hard to take care of them in this climate," which implies that they are quite old, which would make sense if, he's been taking care of them since his wedding day. But if that is true, which that seems pretty strong in terms of evidence, you would think that within the Dark World, these flowers would represent something to do with the family, right? They'd represent Asgore clinging onto the past. Like, he's literally clinging onto these flowers and keeping them alive, probably long past their, natural lifespan, because they mean something to him, right? So it only makes sense that they would turn into darkeners based on Asgore's sort of desire for them to fill the gaps in his life, which could mean they fill in the broken family that he is no longer technically, well, he is a part of it, but you know, he's not like super in the mix right now. And there's a few ways you can do that, and I'm just going to walk you through my thought process here, kind of, because I think that will be more interesting. So one of the reasons why I think this is probably going to be at least an aspect, even if they aren't super blatant representations of these characters, is other than Asgore, there are 7 members of the Holiday plus Dreamer family, right? 7 flowers, 7 members of the family Asgore doesn't have anymore. It all kind of slots into place that way. Now, trying to map which flower might turn into which person kind of doesn't mean anything. Like, you know, if they're all there anyway, what does it matter if Chris is the green flower? But I think it could tell us something about the way Asgore sees these characters, because Asgore is the one who's put the traits onto these flowers, right? Like, he's the one who's been raising them. So it would stand to reason that those traits would carry over into their Dark World forms. Especially if he's the one who makes the Dark Fountain, which, to be clear, we don't know, but he does have the Black Shard, and I don't know, it's a little, that means he's fought the night before. I don't know, that's a little suspicious. Anyway, I have Rudy as the golden flower, or the red flower, because it represents the red soul, right? Strictly because Asgore sent him red flowers. In the same way I have Toriel as the purple flower, strictly because he gives Toriel purple flowers as a bouquet. That said, I do think the flower meanings, which is what you see on the bottom of the screen here, do kind of line up. Like, okay, depending on how you want to see Asgore and Rudy's relationship, you can throw desire and love into there for sure. But passion does make sense for Rudy. He's a very passionate person. Yeah, I can believe that. And the same for Toriel, like admiration, success, royalty. In the Dark World, she turned into a queen, right? So that all kind of tracks. I also have Ralsei as a reason for Chris to potentially be the green flower. Part of that is just because Chris is Asgore's youngest child. So the idea that, you know, Chris to him would represent youth and vitality, and change. That does track. And, you know, Ralsei and Chris have a lot in common, obviously. Like, I mean, my next video is going to be about the origins of every Darkner we've had so far, so I won't say too much about Ralsei. But clearly, you know, the red horns, the dreamer aesthetic, Ralsei and Chris are somehow related, right? And then, I mean, this is the biggest stretch, but, you know, Azrael used to be a golden flower, but again, the golden flower represents red. So if we were going to represent, you know, a golden flower, we could use the yellow flower and it'd be friendship, which, you know, Azrael's a very friendly person. Everybody in town is his friend, right? That makes sense. Totally. And look, Carol has the blue flower because she's blue. And then Des is energy and excitement, which makes sense. And Noelle is peace and calm because she's very patient. But that's a little spoiler for the next part because it's the soul traits associated with these flowers. And I do think this makes more sense. So we've moved some people around. We're going to start from the right side this time because I think the left side is way more interesting. We're starting with Carol being the yellow flower. Carol seeking justice for Des. That tracks a lot. To be fair, she was one of the last ones I put in, but it was between her and Toriel with justice or integrity. And it could really work either way, but Carol feels much more aligned with justice than integrity specifically, right? You know, I said Ralsei and Chris have a lot of crossover. Ralsei and Azrael also have a lot of crossover. And from what we know about Azrael and Undertale, which none of that may be true in Deltarune, but, you know, I have to try. It does seem like Ralsei is kind of a Azrael-like character, so him being the green flower for kindness, that makes a lot of sense. Rudy was actually the first one I placed, because Rudy being perseverance makes a ton of sense. He's sick in the hospital, and yet he keeps going, right? He drags himself out of that bed to go to church, just for Noelle's sake. Even though, like, you know, there's probably an aspect to it where he's like, I don't know how many of these I'm going to have, like how many more of these big gatherings I'm going to get a chance to get to. But if he was being selfish for his health, staying in the hospital would certainly be a better decision. Anyway, perseverance makes a lot of sense to me for Rudy. I'm going to leave Toriel to the very end because, yes, she was the last one I placed. We'll get there. Noelle, interestingly, still stays on the cyan soul, or the cyan flower. Although, now we can kind of connect it to maybe ice. Like, Noelle is very associated with ice, and the ice that she specifically creates is this light blue cyan color. So, that kind of makes sense. I just think patience works for her the most because she is someone who doesn't speak up for herself, right? She waits for things to happen to her, essentially. So that just kind of tracks. Now, Chris being the bravery soul might have you scratching your head a little bit. Like, doesn't Chris turn cyan in the Dark World? Shouldn't Chris be patience? And I understand that totally, because that was my original thought too. But the more you read into Deltarune and what the story might be about, the more I think, oh, Chris is far more aligned with the orange soul than the cyan soul, or really any other. For one, Chris's power is courage. In chapter 1, after you talk to the king with each of the characters, they gain a new skill, right? Ralsei gets dual heal, and Susie gets red buster, and Chris gets courage. And that's very interesting because the Titans, the main enemies of this story, are made of fear. So this interrelationship between the hero being related to courage and the enemies being related to fear, that really fits, right? And courage and bravery, I mean, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close in terms of meaning. So I could definitely see that as being a possibility. And then obviously, if Des is the knight is shooting red energy all over the place. And, Des is also associated with red when she was, around as well. She's got a red guitar. She has red shoes. Her room is partly red. So, yeah, and Carol keeps buying these red heart pillows. Very suspicious. Anyway, Des being the one that has the red determination, possibly, soul, does make sense. Even though, again, we don't really know what the red soul's trait is, if it even has one. But determination is just, the fan concept, so... and then finally, Toriel ends up with integrity. It does track because her whole thing is, taking care of people. So the idea of integrity is basically you're consistent to your internal morals, right? Ironically, chapter 4 is the worst example of this ever, where, but it is kind of funny because who else is associated with a blue soul? That's right, Sans Undertale. So maybe it works out that way. If we combine the two with the much more right-feeling placements with the soul traits and now bring back the flower meanings, it actually does give us an interesting idea of how Asgore might feel about each of these characters. Asgore seeing Asriel as someone who's youthful and embodies change does make a lot of sense because obviously Asriel lost a lot when Des disappeared and has now gone off to college. Assumedly, Asriel's going to come back and be a different person, right? At least in Asgore's view of things. And, I mean, mine too, but that makes sense. Carol being friendship. I mean, those two are the ones that are hanging out the most right now. Sure, Rudy and Toriel get along. We don't get a lot of evidence that they hang out still, though. Whereas Carol and Asgore seem to have some sort of weird relationship going on. Probably trying to find Des, right? But, friendship does make sense for Asgore and her. Rudy being the purple soul, so being somebody that Asgore admires, somebody he sees as successful, because, as a father, he's very successful compared to Asgore. And that I understand that as a potential thing that might come up in this chapter. Respecting Toriel, but not understanding her, because blue also includes mystery. That makes a lot of sense. I don't have to talk about Noelle, because she was the same one both times. Chris being energy and excitement actually does make a lot of sense from Asgore's perspective, because Asgore remembers Chris as they were when they were a kid, right? This rambunctious gremlin that was always causing trouble. So energy and excitement makes a ton of sense. And now don't read too much into the Red Soul here, okay? But December being somebody who Asgore thinks of as being very passionate, as in she had passions and she pursued them to their greatest extent, does seem to fit with what we know of her character so far. So yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you could also maybe read into it that Asgore knew about Asriel and Des being in a relationship, which it really seems like they were. And that's what he thinks about when he thinks about her. But, who knows? Now, the interesting thing about this that I haven't brought up yet is, hey, this would be a chance for us as a Deltarune only player, let's say, who doesn't watch theory videos or deep dives into the code, to meet Des before the reveal of her as the knight, if that is truly the way the story is going to go, and to get a setup on Asriel as an actual character before he shows up in maybe the next chapter or the chapter after. So I think this is actually a good idea in terms of the narrative as well, to introduce us to versions of these characters that can't literally be here right now, right? So let's talk about the Garden of Eden. What? So obviously the Garden of Eden is a garden, and we know that chapter 5 is going to have some sort of garden in it. But that's not why I've put this out here, right? There's a lot in Deltarune that could coalesce into some sort of Garden of Eden metaphor in chapter 5. So let's go over each of those things. First off, there's a lot of symbolism in Deltarune to the forbidden fruit. So if you're not familiar, which I'm only partly familiar, so if I get anything wrong, sorry, I'm doing my best here. In the Garden of Eden, the story is basically that, Adam and Eve are there and God says, don't eat the apples on the apple tree. And then a snake, which may or may not be Satan, comes down and says, you should eat the apple. And then Eve eats the apple and Adam eats the apple, and then they get cast out of the garden, right? And it's like, oh, you idiots. The forbidden fruit is that apple, and that apple gives you knowledge. Knowledge that God didn't want them to have. And that's interesting because the shadow crystals are also knowledge you're not supposed to have, right? They give you knowledge of the world beyond your understanding. And there's also that scene in chapter 4, and it's so weird. It's something that sticks in your head once you see it, of Chris eating the apple. Like, Gerson gives them an apple in that scene where they have the little tea party, and they close their eyes and, bite into it as Ralsei is holding it. And in the weird route, they just keep biting furiously until they eat everything, including the core. But even in the normal route, it's weirdly uncomfortable. Like, during my first playthrough, I thought it was the setup for a joke, where it was going to be revealed that, Chris was not eating the apple the whole time and was, in fact, biting Ralsei's hand. That is not what it was. But it must be there for a reason, right? It's supposed to symbolize something. Perhaps Chris having knowledge of the world that they shouldn't have, which, would not be the weirdest thing considering they know we exist, right? There's also the tale of Hell Takes Crawl. So this relates to Friend. And obviously in this prophecy, the tail is a bunch of little orbs, and then you can find in the files a pointed end at the tip, making it like a demon tail. Now, we've talked about in a few videos recently, this tweet from Temmie in 2018, this was, a couple months before Deltarune released, where she says, a cat's tail is just a snake in disguise, right? And this has led a lot of people to be like, Jockington and Friend are the same person? And that is hilarious. But it could also relate to the Garden of Eden story, right? The snake in the story is the devil in disguise. Friend is already related to a lot of demonic stuff, just in terms of the number 6 and being a dark entity that spies on you from afar. And, corrupted spammed in with a deal. So, yeah, that makes sense. But perhaps in this chapter, it will be more literal, And the cat will take on a different form. Friend will take on some sort of form to trick us into doing something, which sounds a lot like the, where the forest will grow, the children follow the pointed tail, as being a warning, right? We're not going to realize we're following the pointed tail until it's too late, because it's disguised in the same way as in this Garden of Eden story. If the chapter revolves around the wedding flowers and they come back as a replacement family for Asgore, this could reference the story of Lilith. And now, as far as I understand it, Lilith is essentially a Bible OC, so not canonical. But the basic idea is like, originally, God created Adam and Lilith, and they were supposed to be together. But, Lilith thought for herself too much. Can't have that. So she got cast out of the garden, and then Eve was made from a part of Adam, so she would be subservient to Adam. Yay! And then she ended up doing the thing in the Garden of Eden anyway, so whatever. But if there are tutorials, essentially, haha, yes, I know, where there is real Toriel, and then this, like, Toriel literally of Asgore's creation, right? He has imbued all of his emotions about Toriel onto this flower, and now it's come to life. That kind of parallels what I just said, right? Where Toriel is no longer wanting to be together with Asgore, and so there is a replacement Toriel that is made for Asgore. And, Eve's the one who gets the forbidden fruit, so if this Toriel 2, not tutorial, Toriel 2, ends up, following that part of the story, that could be a recipe for a secret boss. A Toriel secret boss. Whoa! Radical. Also, this is completely nothing, but I do think it's funny, and it might not be a coincidence. But Lilith, after, getting cast out, ends up kind of hooking up with this angel. You'll never guess what the angel's name is. That's right, it's Sans Undertale. No, it's Samael, which is still pretty close. It probably doesn't mean anything, but it's kind of funny. There is a lot of religious symbolism in Deltarune. Like, there's also the whole thing about an ark in Raise Up Your Bat, and it's there. It's definitely there. Spamth talks about heaven. So people have said it in the comments before, and, I've said it now too. If somebody wanted to do an actual, like, biblical analysis of Deltarune, I think we'd probably learn a decent amount. But, I'm not that person, so feel free. All right. The main themes. Now, I had this in my other two prediction videos because I actually had a guess on the main themes. In this one, I can only, like, gesture at an idea. There is this pattern that people have noticed, which I do think is real, where in Chapter 2 with Spamton, that was sort of a Chris-focused secret boss, right? It taught us a lot about Chris. And in Chapter 4, and Chapter 3 is an outlier because the knight didn't make those fountains, or that fountain, rather. I'm about to talk about Chapter 4, so I got confused. Anyway, in Chapter 4, Gerson, the secret boss, is focused a lot on telling us about Susie as a character, right? So there's this idea that the Chapter 5 secret boss will tell us something about Ralsei as a character. And I mean, hey, if it's evil Toriel or whatever, that could make a lot of sense. Because Ralsei is already kind of a copy of somebody else trying to make their own stake on happiness, right? We'll get into here at the end of this slide, but let me just start at the beginning. Asgore's perfect world would be the same as his regular world, but like a decade ago, where all the kids were still hanging out together and Des was still here, and he hadn't, like, I don't know, centered the shelter code by accident and let her disappear or something. Or if you believe the internet, run her over in his car. And him and Toriel were still together, and Rudy wasn't sick, so everybody could just hang out and have fun. And this dark world would be a representation of that. The family's back together, they can just do fun stuff, and as long as the Dark Fountain doesn't get sealed, Asgore never has to reckon with his real life again. Yay! It's literally the ultimate explanation of the themes we've seen so far in Deltarune, right? In Chapter 2, we had Birdly say stuff like, isn't the Dark World just better? And the reason for that is because all of these real-world stressors aren't in it. But of course, if you lived in the Dark World the whole time, eventually those real-life stressors would show up in it, right? Like, if you gave it enough time, the mystical qualities of the Dark World would wear off, and eventually it'd just be life again. Anyway, that's a tangent. But the idea that Asgore might retreat into this Dark World, or, get trapped in asylum, you might say, isn't bizarre. It's very in keeping with what we've seen from his characters so far. And either at the end of this chapter, he is going to accept that things have changed and try to live with it, or, the garden will be burned in an inferno of jealousy, maybe. Anyway, I think the Flower family are going to slowly start to develop their own personalities, in the same way that Ralsei has developed his own personality over time, right? And Asgore is going to be trying to stop it, because Asgore is afraid of change. That's the theme I'm clinging onto here. And this will tie into Ralsei's character arc of his doubts over whether a Darkner should truly do what's best for them and their happiness, or do what's best for Lightners, who are more important, and their happiness. What would Ralsei do in that situation if Chris was like, no, I don't want you to change, I want you to be just like my brother? What would Ralsei do? Right? And that's the question that this chapter would essentially ask. And then, yes, the secret boss could be Toriel 2, where, after learning about Asgore potentially going back to the real world, she kind of, not to use an anime term, I know Chris hates them, but goes yandere. Or, she gets tricked by Friend, or is given this shadow crystal that shows her that she's not real, and suddenly her worldview falls apart. And maybe the Inferno of Jealousy is in fact not Asgore's jealousy, but this Toriel's jealousy, that Asgore would leave the family behind to pursue a different world, right? Just stay here. Either way, it should use the blue soul power, which would be funny if Toriel used the blue soul power, again, considering her current relationship with Sans, who is very associated with that power. If we get Toriel Gaster Blasters, probably not, but you never know. All right, Asgore. This is my last slide. So, just because Asgore's been a boss before doesn't mean he can't be one again. A little typo in the slide there, but don't look at that, okay? Just don't look at it. The fight would just have to be different, which I don't think is that much of a stretch, right? Like, arguably, you could say that Spamton Neo, well, that's just Mettaton Neo again. But it's obviously not, right? It's totally different. And this Asgore is actually very different from the Asgore we fight in Undertale. Asgore in Undertale is very, well, reluctant is a good word. I put it on the slide. I should just use it. He genuinely is sort of torn between the idea of actually killing this other child and letting all the monsters free, but being, a evil person forever, or just laying down and dying because he's so guilty for what he's done, and just letting the child go, right? Like, he's not fighting at full force to stop Frisk. No, he is fighting for sure because he feels obligated to, but he is not determined, let's say, to win that battle in the same way he might be if his entire, new family and perfect world are at stake. Or, it could be some sort of gimmick. We don't know that he has a trident in this version of reality. But hey, I already kind of talked about this last point in the last slide. I think it fit better there, to be honest. But the idea that the inferno of jealousy that Gerson references could be the Toriel flower or Asgore. Either Asgore burning down the world as a result of, the jealousy he feels towards Sans and reality not going his way, or the Toriel flower getting influenced by Friend and burning down the world, getting jealous of Toriel 1, who's in the real world and doesn't want Asgore to return there. However, there is kind of an interesting idea, and this ties into my own theories, so you don't have to subscribe to this. It's completely fine. But I like the idea, we were talking about Ark earlier, of the shelter as an ark. Sort of a place to protect you from the disaster that is coming, that being the roaring, obviously. And I think the first thing you're supposed to think about when you see the shelter is like, okay, this is the big, scary, spooky, goopy place where evil Gaster lives and the knight is there kidnapping and torturing people or something. But I think it could be the opposite. It could be a perfect world. I already talked about this earlier in this video about, the garden being Asgore's perfect world because his family is back together. Well, if Asgore can't beat the heroes because, he's not willing to actually harm anybody or something like that, there isn't another option. Asgore can just agree to go with the knight. We don't know who the knight is kidnapping and really for why at this point. But Asgore is related to the police station, and so far the two people that the knight has targeted, that being Toriel and Undyne, were both related to the shelter code in some way. Like, Toriel's related to Asgore, so she probably knew the code. And Undyne definitely knew the code. And Asgore also definitely knew the code. So, if the knight is targeting the people who know the code, Asgore would be on the knight's hit list. And if the knight shows up at the end of this chapter and is like, I'm going to take you away to the shelter, it's my perfect world, Asgore could go, really? You would do that? And just you grab the flowers and you leave. Wow, you can keep the family together. Yeah, yay. And then trapped in asylum would also make sense, right? Asgore has willingly become trapped in the shelter in order to live in his fantasy world. It's a pretty mean-spirited interpretation of Asgore, but to be fair, my idea in saying that is that eventually he would learn the error of his ways and come around at the end of the game, right? It's not that he'd stay a villain or whatever forever. And I think there is maybe an extra little part to that, given the fact that Asgore does seem to know what the Black Shard is, which is a part of the Knight's Sword, implying that Asgore and the Knight have maybe met before, or at least somebody in the Knight have met before, and Asgore knows that person. In other words, Carol. So yeah, that's the end. Poor guy. Don't forget your eggs, husband. Well, we'll never forget about you now, buddy. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's kind of goofy, but I don't think any of this is actually going to happen necessarily, other than the broad points of Asgore will probably be there, and Friend probably will show up, and the flowers will do something. But I hope this stimulated your brain for going into the newsletter whenever we get it during this month of September. And, it'll be fun for me because I can go through the newsletter being like, oh, that could still happen. That could be evidence of my theory. Or, oh, that kills my theory, which is extra fun for me when it comes to those newsletters. So yeah, like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you would like, telling me about what you think Chapter 5 will be. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.